Okay, great. I see people coming in, so we're going to wait about a minute before we begin, and I will introduce everyone and we'll continue from there.
Good stuff. Thanks for joining, guys. See more people are coming in now. And good to meet you, Steve. Again, we've known each other for 100 years, haven't we?
Definitely. Long time.
Well,
Good to see you
20
again.
years, I think. 15 years or something like that, right? Yeah.
It's good to see you coming out with new things. I'd like to learn more about hosted.ai.
Well, that's what we're here for. So good stuff.
Right. All right, let's get started. So first of all, welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I know calendars are full, so I genuinely appreciate you being here. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephen Higashi, and today's session is hosted with Hosted.ai. We're going to be talking about um, the company, what it does, how it can help you. But more importantly, we're going to focus on what actually works in the real world, not theory for theory's sake. So the goal today is simple, to give you practical insight you actually take away, whether you're a consultant running infrastructure or just making sense of where things are heading. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we dive in. Feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but Ditlev doesn't mind you asking questions in the middle. So we'll
No, just go
interrupt
for it,
every so
guys.
often.
Yeah.
And if something comes up that's relevant in the moment, we may address it live. So this session is being recorded if you need to step away or want to revisit something later. You'll have access to it at any time. Now, with that said, let's give you a quick outline of what we'll cover today. So the brief agenda. Let's introduce the company first, and we'll go from there. Dilip?
Cool. Thanks, Steve. And good to meet you again, Steve. It's been a while. And thanks everyone for joining. Also, my name is Ditlev, and I'll be talking about well, a little bit about hosted AI in the end, but more about this craziness going on in our industry around AI and the whole GPU as a service phase that we're all entering now, being forced to enter now. And I'll be talking about what I would do if I was a hosting company. God knows I've been running hosting companies for many years. And if I had to start all over, how would I do it? What would I do? What would I care about? About the funny trends in the industry. But starting out, just introducing myself. So yes, I am Ditlev, and I've been in the industry for 100, well, not 100 years, but 30 years, literally actually. I started my first service provider back before before browsers almost. It was BBSs and stuff like that. I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to actually remember those days, but I had BBS servers, news servers back in the 90s. But mostly really if you guys, if I've met any of you guys before, back then it was probably when I had UK2 Group. We built brands like 100tb.com, VPS.net, UK2net, and so on and so on. I had that for a number of years and then started OnApp afterwards. OnApp was like a cloud in a box. We had a bunch of brands in there as well. Solos VM we owned for a while. I didn't start Solos VM. Most of you probably know Phil who did that, but I bought it from Phil. And I ran CDN.net, Cloud.net, and a bunch of other brands. And now I'm running hosted AI. And I'll be talking about hosted AI in the end. That's kind of the summing up I'll be doing here. But what I've basically been doing is I've been running dedicated server businesses through shared hosting businesses, through virtual private servers, through cloud, and now GPU and AI. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the GPU and AI hosting market. And what's going on is it's a crazy time right now. So let me just close this one up here. So today, 28, actually, the number is more like 30% of all infrastructure revenue comes from AI. 77% of all SaaS applications, as you can see in the box, sorry, the little bubble in the left corner, has an AI component to it. Most of those components would be integrated with OpenAI or with Claude or something like that. But 77% of all SaaS applications, and this number is actually a little bit old now, so the number is probably way bigger, has an AI element to it. And it's a number that is growing like crazy, pushing $4 trillion of AI infrastructure revenue in 2030. Um, and kind of the use cases, I'll jump into those in a second, but we are talking about training, fine tuning, and inferencing, and just going into those here. Training is probably, I mean, maybe you guys are already familiar with these three phrases, but I'll take you just briefly through them. Training is when you build a foundation model. So you have everything from OpenAI to Claude, but also the DeepSeeks and similar models that are out there, Llama models and so on. They all going through a rigorous training process that kind of fills the logic with data and makes them able to help companies provide inference services later on. But for those inference services to work, you need to add a ton of fine tuning to them. For example, if you are Expedia and you are using DeepSeek to sell hotel rooms in Paris, you need to tell the model about the specific notions around your hotel rooms, about how you sell them, about what your terms and conditions are, and so on and so on. And that's the fine tuning going on top of the foundational model. And then finally, the inferencing is actually the process of delivering that fine-tuned service. So the inferencing is what's going on when you are talking to a customer service agent, or whether you are going through some recommendations being given to you, or maybe when you're chatting with ChatGPT. You guys are probably all aware of this. So I'll jump super fast through this. But the notion here is that those three things combined is $4 trillion of revenue for our industry, for the service provider industry as a whole. And 80% of that already next year will most likely be sitting in the last part, the inferencing part. And the inferencing is sort of that's the result of the foundational models. And I'd like to call the foundational models the new internet. If you take the old internet, or the internet that we're all using today, when we built that back in the 90s, we effectively put in undersea cables. We invented, that's a little bit earlier, but TCP/IP and 3 times W, and we built browsers, Mosaic and Firefox and all of those things that came back then. And that formed the internet that we're all using today, the kind of version one of the internet. But the new internet is effectively the foundation models. It's the models that we've been training for the last 3 to 5 years. And we are just about done with it now. There will be popping up new models. You will see a new DeepSeek, you'll see new image generation models and stuff like that coming on all the time. We see these trends now coming with the sort of micro models coming out as well, so small language models as well. But effectively, it's the new internet. It's the new way of addressing the internet. It's a new way of communication through the internet. It's a new way of searching and solving problems on the internet. We've seen shifts like this before, like 2008. We went suddenly from a doubling in shipments in 1 year when the iPhone came. So the mobile units doubled because of the iPhones. You saw what happened in cloud. Suddenly Amazon came out. They estimated a 20% negative margin, but actually ended up in 17% positive margins. You had a crazy increase in run rate, all that within 1 year. It's like the whole thing just went bananas in both of those two cases. And now you're seeing it in AI as well. Going from, and this again, a little bit old numbers, 24. I'm sure the trend would continue and probably even increase in 25. But you went a few years sort of trolling along, and then suddenly in 23, the AI infrastructure space blew up. And this is only NVIDIA and obviously Sirius and all the other players in the market have seen similar trends. And another funny number is, for example, Hugging Face, which is the biggest repo, had more than 100 million downloads last year. And that's interesting for us because someone like Hugging Face, when they have 100 million downloads, all of those downloads sit in a data center somewhere. They reside on a GPU somewhere. There's someone is paying for that GPU to be running, and they will be paying us in the industry, the service providers, the hosting companies, the cloud providers, and obviously the neo cloud providers. So 30%, like I said before, of our revenue comes from a GPU today. When I say our revenue, I mean the hosting industry, the service provider industry. 30% of the revenue comes from GPUs. However, only 5% of service providers are actually selling GPUs. It's a little bit of a weird conundrum, right? So 30% of the industry is being served by by 5% of service providers out there. So it's a $4 trillion opportunity currently serviced by only 5% of our industry. I think that's quite scary. And actually, if you look at when I talk to partners or investors about these numbers, and people sometimes compare it to how it was back in the cloud days. So before Amazon, they came and this bookshop came and changed the industry completely. You ended up in a market that initially was maybe 95% service provider. So the VPS scene and the early cloud scene was 95% the traditional service provider industry. So the around 10,000 service providers around the world that sold VPS and cloud servers. And then Amazon came and changed the whole thing around. And today it's like 50-50, maybe 55% traditional service providers and 45% hyperscalers. So the sort of five hyperscalers, the Amazons, the Google Compute, Azure, and so on, sits on around half the industry of all the cloud instances being served. And the other half sits with the sort of longer tail of tier two and tier three service providers, which is around 10,000 across the world. So what we are seeing today is actually the opposite. We are seeing the opposite where only 5% are being served by. So the whole industry, the 30% that is the 30% of 4 trillion is currently being served by only 5% of the industry, which would effectively mean that it is I'll get back to that in a second, but it's the neo clouds, it's the hyperscalers that have started out and are currently really ruling the market. And to make this even more crazy, the way that these GPUs are sold. So if you are in the GPU market today, you are selling these GPUs typically through pass-through or through, if you are doing any multi-tenancy, is typically through make. And I'll get back to that, why that is super crazy here. So to me, it looks a lot like how the industry kind of worked before VMware, before Zen, before KVM, before Kubernetes and containers and the Virtuoso containers and all the other guys that our industry really was built by. And the reason it's crazy is that imagine back before VMware, when you bought a dedicated server, the utilization rate of that dedicated server might have been 10, 20%, but you still only had these two choices. You had a dedicated server or you had a shared hosting account. And a shared hosting account, typically you had 1,000 virtual accounts on one dedicated server. Whereas in the VPS world, you now had 10 or 20, but before VMware, you only really had the option of either having a dedicated server or a shared hosting account. And that is where you are today with the GPUs. Every GPU is sold as though it's a dedicated server. And the utilization rate of those GPUs being sold sits in inference around 10, 15%. And in fine-tuning, maybe closer to like 20%, 25%, and in training, you might hit 35 or 40%. If you take someone like CoreWeave, I'll be talking about those in a second. Someone like CoreWeave spent like $15-20 billion on GPUs last year in 25. So effectively, 2/3 of that would be sitting unused most of the time. So what is that? $10 billion just on average sitting unconsumed. Most of these guys are looking at this from an occupation rate perspective, not from a utilization rate perspective. But our whole industry, when we sell bandwidth, when we sell shared hosting accounts, when we sell storage in our cloud servers, or when we sell compute, when we sell CPUs, we oversell. That's how our industry works. We overcommit. And yet, when GPUs came, for some reason, our whole industry kind of forgot how we became profitable in the first place. It's super interesting and actually quite ironic. So, as I said, utilization rates are super low, and customers have to buy more capacity than what they need because there is no way for you to have a auto-scaling kind of environment the way you know it from a cloud world. So if you are buying a GPU and if you are fitting an inference workload onto it, you have to buy the GPU that actually fits the peaks of your traffic. While it might be crawling around 10-20% on average, there will be a peak. And the way that it works today, just like it was when you bought dedicated servers, you have to plan your workloads after the peaks, not after your average utilization. So providers might have a high occupancy rate. They might sell 80 or 90% of their GPUs, but each of those GPUs on average are only sold maybe 10. I only utilize maybe 10 or 15%. So the issue with that is that you as a service provider are missing out effectively on maybe being able to overcommit that GPU two, three, four, five times, enabling you to lower your pricing or increase your margins, whatever kind of path you're looking at. So no flexible resource sharing, no optimization for utilization, no way for you as a service provider to overcommit. Look at your CPUs when you sell cloud servers. They're probably overcommitted maybe four or five times. If you are in DigitalOcean, it might be six, seven times. If you are Amazon, it might be four or five times. But you are using the capacity that you've already sold to customer A. If customer A is not using it, you are saying you're selling it to customer B. That's how our whole industry works. That's how a gym works. You go to your gym, there's 50 machines, but 1,000 members. If you buy a ticket on an airplane, that airplane has probably been oversold 10, well, maybe 10, 15%. And they do that because they understand not everyone will turn up. Your gym understand not all 1,000 members will turn up at the same time. That's how our industry works, but it's not how neoclouds, it's not how GPUs are sold today. And that is why you're looking at super unflexible ways of sharing your resources. You're looking at super low margins. You're looking at very high prices as well for the actual buyers in the market. So yeah, it's crazy, but that's just how it's done. Low utilization rates, low margins, and no overcommitment. Going back to the players, who are these 5%? Who's actually in the market today? And it's kind of the usual suspects here. You have the hyperscalers. These are also from a go-to-market pricing perspective, they're like 3 to 5 times higher price than the neoclouds. So the Lambda Labs, CoreWeaves, Nebius, and there's a whole bunch of them. Maybe they're like 10, 15 tier one neoclouds and maybe another 100 tier twos. And then you have the tier two, the tier three service providers, all the ones that are members of Web Hosting Talk. And frankly, there are not a lot of them actually selling GPUs. Not a lot of you guys are part of the 5%. Not a lot of you have a chance of getting any of the $4 trillion of revenue sitting in this space. And the irony here is that the hyperscalers and the neoclouds are actually doing this in a super ineffective way. There is a marketplace out there called Vast AI that are kind enough to expose the performance of the infrastructure that they sell. So Vast AI sell infrastructure from around 200 or so service providers. It's a kind of marketplace and Airbnb of GPUs, you can say. And they expose, for example, the uptime, and the average uptime across all the suppliers of infrastructure at Vast AI was below 99%. And to the untrained eye, that maybe seems high, but all of us on this call knows that you can't run an infrastructure business with less than 4, maybe 5 nines of uptime. You won't be in business for very long. Though when you are neocloud or hyperscalers, the way that they provide their infrastructure, it's typically single tenant. It's there's the optimization of the operation of the infrastructure is super low. They won't have SLAs. There won't be any 24/7 support. It's a really funny thing that the players in this market actually are managed to run with it when they're providing such a poor service compared to what we know as service providers professional, that you need to be multi-tenant. You need to understand how to run an operational sound business. You need to have certifications and all these security policies in place. You also need to overcommit in order for your business to be. The overcommitment is not a dirty word. It makes sense. If customer A is not using it, why would you not take his infrastructure and monetize it somewhere else? Obviously, if customer A comes back, you need to make sure you have the infrastructure available for him. But that's the whole premise of how the cloud works. But when you're a neo cloud, for some reason, it doesn't work like that. It's very inefficient, and it effectively ends up in very high pricing and very poor utilization of your infrastructure. And I said irony here on top, and yeah, it is actually ironic. Because if you look at these guys here, the Lambda Labs, the CoreWeaves, and the Nebius, is probably the highest funded businesses that our industry have ever seen. Even if you go back to the days of building the first internet, putting in the undersea cables, inventing TCP/IP, and building all the browsers, even during the dot-com boom, none of these businesses were in our industry were as well funded as the three neo clouds you have here in the middle and all the ones popping up everywhere. So it is ironic that all this money is being poured into the industry, yet no one is focusing on what you as an end user, as a customer, as an enterprise actually consuming the infrastructure. What would you care about? So it's like we are moving backwards rather than forward. It's like we are having a poor utilization of the infrastructure. And this is also the time where we talk about the environment and having sort of sustainable deployments of data centers. Yet you're seeing all these deployments of GPUs being set up, knowing that the GPUs already sitting there are maybe being utilized on average 20, maybe 30% if you're doing a good job. So I don't think that the issue and the scarcity that you've seen across the GPU scene, especially if you go back a year or two, everyone is talking about scarcity of GPUs, that there wasn't enough to feed the demand, and people are, pouring billions into Stargate and similar projects. No, the issue is that the GPUs already out there are actually not utilized. Two-thirds of the time they're sitting idle. And that's the real problem. And I think it's a problem that we as an industry understand and we know how to solve it. So anyway, back to the point, why is it only 5%? What about the rest of you guys? Why are you not in it? Well, I remember when I ran UK2 Group, we were a substantial business. We had more than 30,000 servers across our 5 data centers, physical servers, 1.2 million customers, super profitable. But still, if someone came and told me that, hey, you need to try this AI stuff, you need to write sort of an initial check of maybe $5-10 million, I would think twice. I wouldn't do it sort of right away without actually looking, what's going on in the market. Is this just a fad? How is this going to pan out? So it is a very capex intensive industry to start in, the neo cloud industry. And what makes it even worse is that a lot of the infrastructure is kind of purpose built. Like, for example, when you had to invest into your cloud servers, those servers that you bought for your clouds could be repurposed other places. You could sell them as dedicated servers. You could sell them, you could even pack them as shared hosting servers, storage servers, or whatever. That is not typically the case with AI infrastructure. The GPUs, which is the most expensive part of this, are purpose built. And when you have all this sort of hype growing around it, I understand why you as a service provider would kind of step back and think, okay, I'm gonna see how this pans out. Another point is it's a brand new skill set, and there are not a lot of options for you to do what you've done for the rest of your offerings. Typically, what service providers do is they go and take for shared hosting, they will take their cPanels or their Plesk or whatever they have for. They will have their favorite email servers, they'll have their favorite billing systems, and so on. Once in a while, they may go ahead and build their own, but typically that's how service providers work. They're very good and very strong at running operational sound businesses, but most service providers are not product experts. Most service providers doesn't have a development team of 40, 50 people or whatever is required to build and manage this. So service providers are server and data center specialists. They're not GPU gurus. And it is a new scene. It is not as trivial to manage this as the rest of your infrastructure. And then the third part, when I invest all this capex and I invest in smart people that can actually manage it, how am I going to sell it? It's a different market. What are kind of the levers that I can pull in order for this to be successful? Like if we go to a shared hosting business or a dedicated server business, you know exactly the levers, you know your CPAs, you know what's sort of shaking the market, and you know that if you lower the pricing here, or if you add the storage there, or if you increase the memory there, you know what happens to your CPAs, you know what happens to your conversion rates. All those things are kind of unknown, and it's harder to generate demand in a market that you don't understand yet. And then I know a lot of us are saying that we are kind of cutting edge, bleeding edge kind of people, but actually having sold to this service provider industry for 20 years, we're all kind of conservative. And I understand why we are conservative. That's how you run a business with 5 nines of uptime, is by not taking risks, is that by not banking on untested and untrial technologies, and not going into markets that you haven't really understood fully before investing into them. So I understand the neophobia here. Most service providers would like to see proof before we test it. However, what we should understand is that just like the market, the cloud market back in 2018, maybe even earlier, 2015, looked super risky. The neo cloud market is equally risky. But if we hadn't, as an industry, invested in it, this 50-50 margin we have with the neo clouds, the hyperscalers versus the tier two service providers. And with tier two service providers, by the way, I would include GoDaddy, I would include Rackspace, I would include all these guys that kind of are competing with the hyperscalers, but also doing it in a non-hyperscaler way. And if we hadn't fought back then, it wouldn't be 50-50. It would look a lot more like it does in the neo cloud world, where you have 5% tier twos, 5% tier two service providers actually participating, and then a handful of neo clouds. So hosted AI, what do we do? Well, we have a full end-to-end GPU as a service software stack. So we enable service providers to get their cloud transformed into a neo cloud. We can do it typically in less than a day. And it's an elastic GPU as a service platform. The most sort of important tenet, I would say, is our ability to introduce multi-tenancy to the actual GPU. So with hosted AI, when you deploy a GPU, your utilization rate goes from the typical sort of 10-15% up to much closer to the 80-90% you should be at. We also help you generate demand. So we have two assets that we have GPUaasaservice.com that is one of our brands where we take quotes on a daily basis and we simply pass them on to our customers, the service providers running hosted AI. The reason we do that is we want to help de-risk their investments. We want to make sure that when they buy these GPUs, that we will from day one become an anchor tenant and actually help create demand, help sell those GPUs that they've bought. And frankly, also we know that once our service providers are running hosted AI, we also know that this will be a good, sound, solid offering. So we are proud to pass that infrastructure onto the people asking us for it at GPUaasaservice.com. We have ways of sourcing GPU infrastructure, and we have a way to finance it as well. And I can dive into that. I can talk a lot more about it. But we have a great network of data centers and service providers that have spare capacity available that will be able to provide that to new entrants to the market in a very flexible way, where you don't have to make the huge investments up front, but where you can kind of taste the market. You can deploy this as you sell it rather than writing the $1 million checks up front. We also have very strong financing partners, in particular, one of them that actually works on a revenue share. So it's not a traditional leasing model where you take the risk, even if you don't manage to generate the demand. Our revenue share financing partners actually continue to own the infrastructure. They put it in your data center, and then they just share the revenue that you bring in, obviously making it completely de-risked for you as a service provider. You can reach out to me afterwards if you want to hear more about that. But it's a turnkey GPU as a service for service providers. We have a control plane. We have a full suite of tools for GPU as a service and neo cloud, completely elastic, software-defined GPU. We also have the whole, if you remember me from the OnApp days, we have the full OnApp sitting in there. So you can sell your CPU, your storage, your memory, and all the other resources. You can have it slide standardized, and it's set up in a super flexible way, just like you remember from OnApp. And then you can upsell the GPUs, or you can lead with the GPUs. But it's an end-to-end platform that takes care of everything from the orchestration of your commodity hardware all the way through to your GPUs. We have billing and metering throughout. We have UIs both for the end users and for the admins, and also down to cluster levels for the supporters. And the results are quite substantial. Typically, I won't dive into these in detail, but typically what we see is our service providers are able to double their margin while they are half their pricing. And they can do that because we at least have 4 times the output of a hosted AI managed GPU compared to a non-hosted AI GPU. So if you got a GPU, you can sell it at least 4 times with hosted AI, whereas without hosted AI, you are stuck with selling it 1 time and having utilization rate and a spare capacity sitting across your infrastructure and kind of lost revenue. That dramatically changed your unit economics. It enables you to be way more profitable while you are way more competitive at the same time. And you know if your pricing are lower than your marketing cost, your CPAs are also lower, and it would kind of make your go-to-market strategy and your whole go-to-market cost as well much simpler and easier and lighter on your wallet as well. So that's what we do. We do three things. Number one, we transform your cloud business into a neo cloud business. Number two, we increase the output per GPU, dramatically changing your unit economics. And finally, we generate demand. So we sell your infrastructure. And by doing that, we de-risk your GPU investments. This is us, founded in 24. We are around 40 people, a little bit more than 40 people across our company. We start selling, I wouldn't say early 25, I think maybe in the middle of 25, June, July, August. We went out of beta last year. We've got a bunch of customers already using us, 15, 17 service providers. Neoclouds are now powered by our software. We, the founders, have been working together for 20 years. James in the right corner and I have been working together all the way since UK2. James running our data centers, he ran support at UK2. Julian was part of the team back in OnApp as well. He ran we called them the labs back then. He was chief scientific officer at OnApp and also ran Sunlight for some years. And Aranda ran US for me back in OnApp. So we as a team have worked together for 100 years, but we've also been in the industry for forever, really. That was really it. I saw some questions popping in ongoingly here, but I just didn't really have a time to dive into them. Should I stop sharing? I think I will here, right? And
Yeah,
hey,
we're
Steve,
gonna
I can see you now.
yeah, we're gonna bring up some questions. I have questions for myself too. So, yeah, any questions? Please submit them in the Q&A area. There we
How
go.
many here are actually selling GPUs? Can I ask that question?
Good question.
Okay, not a lot of are willing to share. Maybe that's no one then. I mean, I guess if you are selling GPUs, I can see a lot of the brands here that of the participants. I know some of you are actually in the market. And most of you are probably selling a dedicated server with a bunch of GPUs in them. And that kind of puts you in the 5%, but it doesn't really put you in how this will be sold tomorrow. So today, most of you guys would be selling maybe a dedicated server with the GPUs, and then tomorrow you may be selling GPU as a service, so selling them on a single GPU by GPU. But the way that the industry is moving is that it's going to be token factories where you're selling this on a token basis. So some price per 10 million of tokens. It's going to be models where you're selling DeepSeek as a service, and you're selling that maybe on an hourly basis, maybe on the input output of those models. And maybe this will be sold on teraflops. Maybe it will be sold on VRAM. And all of those, this is where the market is moving into a much more flexible way of slicing and dicing your infrastructure. And doing that just on a dedicated server is going to be super hard and frankly not very profitable as well.
I'm actually curious myself, what are the best practices for security though? Because when you think about it, what do you need to think of?
Yeah, I mean the security is interesting, right? Because once you start having multi-tenancy on a GPU, you suddenly have, and we've been through the same thing back in the early days of cloud. And it's probably the one part we have been focusing most on. So when you deploy a GPU inside a hosted AI structure, you have the choice. You have that kind of a slider, a security slider, when you decide the overcommit rate, where you put it from a super secure when everything is nulled every time there's a new tenant on the infrastructure, and it's kind of non-shared in the way that you would only see one tenant on the GPU at the same time, but the tenant kind of content switch back and forth super fast according to the usage of the GPU. And then you have all the way to the other end where you may have a team of people sharing the same GPU. And from that perspective, that GPU will be shared in a what we call spatial virtualization way that where in principle you have more lighter access to the other workloads running on the GPU. But if you are one team, then it doesn't matter as much as if you are running a multi-tenancy team, top multi-tenancy access to the same GPU with users that are not known to each other. So security with hosted AI, you kind of decide how secure it should be at the time when you put the overcommitment rate.
Oh, we got a few questions coming in now.
Okay, cool. I can't actually see the questions, Steve, but you can, right? So.
Oh, okay. Well, let's answer the first one. I would like to know, how is the market looking for A100s? Is it risky to get it for a 1 to 2 year ROI?
So A100s, I mean, one of the problems in the industry, in the neo cloud industry, is that the way that Jensen and Nvidia and the other guys in the market have been selling this is like every sort of 6 months, there's a new generation of cards coming out. And then the most buyers have been focusing on these cards and looking, oh, this is the only card that works. And why would I look at an A100 when there are H100s? And why would I look at an H100 when there are B200s? And why would I look at Blackwell when there is, and so on and so on and so on. Um, and if you go back and look at how the industry was in 2000, this is how CPUs were sold. You remember that, Steve. When you bought a dedicated server back in 2000, you actually cared about what CPU was inside of it. Then, when virtualization came, you had an abstraction layer on top of the CPUs. And if you go to Amazon today or DigitalOcean or whatever, you may know if it's an Intel or AMD. You may not even not know that, but you certainly have no clue if it's the latest or if it's 2 generations ago. So I think my answer to the question is that today, if you're selling GPUs as a service, it may be a bit hard to sell a A100. However, as soon as you introduce multi-tenants into it, you kind of transform that A100 into what it effectively is, which is compute and memory. And then it doesn't matter anymore if that computer memory comes from an A100, a H100, or a B200. I hope that answers the question. So 1 2 year ROI, if you're virtualizing, the answer is yes. If you don't, the answer is no.
Cool. Excellent. We have another one here. If the core inefficiency is low GPU utilization, what stops hyperscalers from solving this themselves? And how defensible is your position when they inevitably try?
Super question. I think the reason they're not doing it today is because of the scarcity in the market. So if you're a service provider, it's interesting. CoreWeave went public and they are S1, where suddenly there's a lot of data points in that S1 that was super interesting. One of the interesting data points is that they have an 80-90% occupancy rate, which means they sell 80 to 90% of whatever GPUs they have. But they have a 35%, and this was in the training days, so this was like 2024, 2025, as 35% utilization rate. So if you are selling already 80-90% of what you have, you don't care much about the occupancy rate. Sorry, the utilization rate. And I think that's probably why they have built this the way they have, and they have focused on the buying of GPU rather than the utilization of GPU, because frankly, they've sold everything they've been able to bring to the market. And it's been the Wild West, right? That's also why they could get away with having one of this. I'm not going to name and shame, but I mentioned 3 service providers in one of my previous slides. One of these guys, the first half year of 2025, the average uptime was 96%.
Oof.
And which is pretty, it's like days of downtime on average per month, right? And the reason they could get away with that because it's the Wild West, because of the scarcity of GPUs and because of the only 5% of the service providers out there actually providing it. I think when we as an industry kind of matures, and when the neo cloud part of it not only is sitting with the current Bitcoiners, because that's what most of these guys actually used to be Bitcoiners, but actually matures into an industry that is managed and operated by you guys, by the service providers that understand that 5 nines of uptime is a must, that understands that, hey, the utilization rate in order for you to run a profitable business needs to be high. You can't have infrastructure you already paid for not being utilized. So how defensible is it? Well, frankly, I do believe that going forward 2 years, this is how stuff is done. And we'll be one of the platforms. Today, we are the only platform, but I bet there'll be more. We'll be one of the only platforms that you can do it with, enabling you to increase your utilization rate, to increase your margins and to lower your pricing at the same time. But there is a window now of maybe 2 years where if you do virtualize, I remember this back when I ran UK2. I remember when Zen and KVM and VMware came, those of us that utilized it at the early times, we had like a year or maybe 2 years of insane growth, of insane margins, because we did this at a speed that most of our competitors didn't. So there will be kind of, I think, a race of where over the next sort of a window, over the next 1 to 2 years, where a number of service providers will introduce virtualization and multi-tenancy to their GPUs and be able to lower the pricing. And right now, pricing is the only metric that matter. God knows uptime doesn't, but that will just be once you start doing inferencing, people will see how important it is. But the pricing is the only lever that actually matters today. And you, as a virtualized GPU host, can lower your pricing by 50% and increase your margins by 100% at the same time. And sure, when everyone does this, that is the new normal. But until then, there is a lot of money to be made. And I think that window is probably 24 months.
Oh, wow. Well, as GPUs move forward and you got the L40s and the H100s and so on and so forth, at some point they're gonna become either obsolete or old, like 86000s, 5000s, and 4000s. So how do you arrange order or do you zone your cloud that way?
Well, I think if you go, I talked about these trends a while ago about the tokens being sold instead of GPUs, about the GPU, the teraflops or the memory being sold, and rather than the GPU itself. That's the same thing as we saw back in early 2000s when dedicated servers were virtualized. And I think what happens once you have this abstraction layer, then your A100 and your even your K80s or whatever old GPUs you have, your V100s, are effectively transformed into teraflops and VRAM. So suddenly you're no longer selling a K80, you're selling whatever teraflops it had. And those tokens generated by your K80 would, maybe K80 is a stupid example because they're quite old, but your A100s at least, would be just as good as the tokens being sold by your H100s. There's a little difference in the bandwidth of the memory, but it's unnoticeable in the grander scheme of things. So if you're doing inferencing, and if that is token based, those tokens can be delivered on a 2 generation ago GPU just as well as they can on the latest and greatest.
And is the best practice, remember in cloud at OnApp, we came to the conclusion that you needed about 20% extra for burst. I'm wondering if that's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, in hosted, we learned a lot from OnApp, and one of the things was that one thing is I kind of look at this as Tetris blocks. So you have these workloads being thrown at all the GPUs. And what hosted does is it kind of places them as Tetris blocks. So we get this task coming to us, AI task. We put it at a GPU where there is a size of spare capacity looking like the task. And that's to some extent what autoscaling did back in OnApp. But what we didn't do in OnApp was the reallocation of tasks. So let's say that there was a bursty thing happening in one of the GPUs. What we couldn't do in OnApp was move all the stuff that was there to another CPU. In OnApp, we are able, sorry, in hosted AI, we are able to reallocate the Tetris blocks, if you will. So let's say a Tetris block is a workload is being placed on this GPU over here. And then suddenly another workload sitting on the same GPU has a huge spike. Then we will move all the workloads going on, all the AI tasks going on this GPU to another GPU, and all that is automated and happening in real time without downtime or any impact on the service being managed from it.
Okay.
So suddenly the spare capacity and the sort of the 20, 30% that we talked about in OnApp as spikes and the sort of available space required for you to run a sustainable business is not needed anymore.
Ah, okay. We're just waiting for more questions to come in. If anyone has more questions, let us know in the Q&A.
If not, guys, it's been a pleasure to meet you all, and thanks for turning up and thanks for listening to me. And I hope I have a chance to talk to you afterwards. You guys can reach out to me. I'm at Ditlev or hosted.ai, or look me up on LinkedIn or whatever. Good stuff. Thanks, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us,
Good to
and
see you
audience,
again.
thanks for joining us.
And thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Have a
Cool.
great day. Enjoy your week. See
Thank
you,
you, guys.
everyone.